You and I decided on a topic for today, dealing with issues and risks.
Yeah. Problems in the future and problems today.
Well,
Let's actually start off with that. What do you think about issues and risks?
let me do it this way. You know, we get involved in the whole technical process of issues and risks on projects. But what if I brought something from a little closer to home from my personal experience recently? My wife and I, as a kind of a side gig, run a short-term rental. So think Airbnb or VRBO or that sort of thing. Well, when we bought the place and began to refurbish it, there was these two huge, I'm talking 50-foot, 60-foot cottonwood trees in the back they offered this beautiful shade. We did not want to get rid of them. And our neighbors had said, they're getting up there in years. They're 30, 40 years old, and it's kind of risky to have those in your backyard, especially as close as our walls are, or, as close as our neighborhood yards are and that sort of thing. And I thought, oh, but this is so attractive for our guests coming to our Airbnb. I'm going to leave them, knowing that this is a risk. Now, to mitigate the risk, every so often I'd bring in tree people to check out the trees. I took out some large limbs to make sure they wouldn't break off at some point. And I thought I was being responsible, mitigating the risk, and also accepting the risk. Well, very recently we had a microburst. A windstorm came through and it had a microburst, and it took off a limb that's as large as many trees. And that limb came crashing down on our spiral staircase that goes to the rooftop deck, and took it out and twisted it, broke it off of the side of the house. And here's the bad part. Had that spiral staircase not been there, it would have crashed through the sunroom where one of our guests was sitting quietly reading.
Oh, wow.
So my risk became an issue. It is now an issue because I need to get all that repaired. But it's one of those things. And now if we can extrapolate that to our conversation around projects, risks and issues are very real things. Maybe not life-threatening as in the situation I just described, but very real things. So how's that for starting off?
That's a great start. That's a good reminder. It's funny because we don't spend a lot of time on risk planning, but we take a lot of time in managing issues. If we can't get proactive, we're going to be dealing with issues. We're not just going to deal with risks. And like you said, you mitigated that risk, but mitigation is only partial, solving of that risk. There's always a little bit of that risk left over that you have to handle as well.
Well, and I guess the surprising part for me, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised, we get wind here in our local area. We do get those winds, especially in the spring and sometimes in the fall. But the microburst, think, what do the airline pilots call these? When suddenly the plane falls kind of a couple hundred feet.
Oh, yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. And so even if you try to mitigate the risk as well as you can, the unexpected can still hit, and you have to be prepared for that.
What do they call those? They call those unidentified risks, right?
Yeah, unidentified risks. Yeah.
Wow.
And now it's an issue for me because it's going to cost. Insurance covers, but it's going to cost substantial amount of money to replace that. It weighs several thousand pounds.
So here we go. We have issues that are here and now, and we have to be ready for an impact. And then we have a future issue. How do they go hand in hand? And how can we put issue management and risk management together to make sense?
Well, in my mind, and again, I'm thinking back to some of the experiences I've had on projects, large projects. In my mind, issues need to be dealt with now because they're real. They're in front of us. They're hampering our ability to proceed. They may be cutting into our project schedule. They may be delaying. Whatever it is, we need to get on those and make sure we handle them immediately. Risks, I think, where you're getting at, is we, from past experience or from what the current environment is on our project, we can potentially see something could happen, but it hasn't yet been realized. And so we keep an eye out for the future, watching it and deciding how to handle it. And maybe as we get closer to that point, we hope to avoid it from becoming a true issue. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we try to do if we're experienced. Now, here's what I'm thinking about. On a lot of the internal projects I did, we could have fudge factors for the response time or the extra budget needed, for the reserve for the risk, schedule and budget reserve. But when you get on a big project and you have to be really precise, what type of estimation do you do for your identified risk reserve, like your the extra time you'll need if this happens, or the extra budget you'll need?
Yeah, and it depends on the environment, Tim, because particularly in my experience, I do a lot of state government IT projects. And after a while, after you talk to other providers of IT services, you talk to the different states, different jurisdictions actually invite their own risks. Some are harder to do business in than others. And so in those situations, we actually elevate the amount of contingency, let's say, that we put in case certain risks happen because they have more strict requirements or that sort of thing. In other areas, we may reduce that because they're a much more amenable client to work with. So it just depends. Environmental factors are always one of those things that we look at.
Wow. Okay, that actually explains a lot. I always wondered, I've had my share of 30 and 40 million dollar projects, but not 100 million to 400 million. I always wondered if there was anything special that you had to do.
Well, and another thing I would do, and you've probably come across this, is let's say you're getting into a project where the client is looking at some newer technology. In my experience, I hated to be on the bleeding edge, but I like to be on the leading edge. But even on the leading edge, there's risk because perhaps your client isn't attuned to what they're asking for. So I don't know about your experience, but I'm sure that you came across that working for a manufacturer as well.
Oh yeah, and again, as a consultant on behalf of that manufacturer, they were putting out technologies that might not go to market for 1 or 2 years, and we were bringing them to clients as clients expressed an interest to start working with them and seeing how they impacted their internal functions. And it was like we were bleeding edge a lot of the time. And so how do we do this? And a lot of this is not just let's think about contingency reserve and management reserve. Let's isolate this project so that we can run it in a pilot model and we can do a few cycles or iterations of this tool so they can understand that. And it was incredible benefit both for the company I worked for and the clients, because they got to experience the bleeding edge, and it didn't impact their environment. So I did a lot of sandbox and pilots for this really new technology.
Now, in a situation like that, like the one that you just described, if you had a client that was willing to collaborate with you and share in the risk, then you can put in less contingency factors for that because they are willing to share.
Yeah, and again, when you start talking about pilot, you start saying, okay, we don't have to worry about disrupting operations.
Yeah.
Number two, can we or can we not be flexible with our schedule? Because even pilots may be driving decision making inside a corporation. So I oftentimes found schedule to be a great constraint on these. They need information right now.
Yeah. Well, and think of this, you and I have had several conversations over the past weeks and months about about Agile and how Agile has become much more prominent in the industry. Well, every team has to do agile the first time. And so in a situation like that, I may put in extra contingency because there is that learning curve that we have to get over. So yeah, there's all of these factors, I think, go in to come up with a good, solid understanding of what could be our risk to deliver the project.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Very good. So here's something that I quiz my students on. Do you use triggers in your risk planning and risk implementation?
I think we do, but not, we probably don't do it in terms of an overt factor. I mean, some things we do. We, if the manufacturer doesn't deliver the computer by this date, we have an issue, right? So there's those sorts of, that's the trigger, the date by which we need the equipment. But I think there's a lot of risks that we put in and we monitor, and we kind of, because of experience or because of whatever, we just kind of understand when this risk has become realized.
Let me give you a really good example. And I did
please.
This a lot of time with a schedule constraint. Let's say that I had a risk that if we didn't launch this product, or if we didn't get this function going by a certain date, it would impact business, right? That was my risk. Okay. And I had a response if that happened.
Yeah.
Now, I also had a trigger that said 30 days before that launch, we're going to do a risk assessment, both as stakeholders and project team together. And then we're going to modify our schedule based on that response. And that way we built in an early warning system. And hopefully, if we respond to that trigger in an appropriate way, that risk doesn't have to ever occur. And we did this, in a lot of situations, like I said, where there are schedule constraints, and we had to be really careful with these upcoming dates. I actually just did this with an Agile project this week. Basically, we had a meeting that wasn't a milestone meeting, but I put a decision that was a critical decision we needed to make in order to, readjust the schedule based on the results of the meeting.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going as well with my description. Because a lot of times when we come in as a system integrator, the teams that I've worked with, we often bid the whole project, including bringing in equipment for our development staff, for testing, all that sort of thing. And so we would, exactly as you described it, we would have milestone points in the project schedule that said, where are we with the manufacturer? Where are we with the OEM that's delivering this equipment? Where are we at this point? Where are we at this point? And then we could monitor the risk that way. So very, very, very similar to what you just described.
What I found, and this is interesting, this is a psychological trick, okay? This is human behavior. Once I stopped calling them milestones and I called them triggers, all of a sudden they were associated to risks and risks to issues. And I said, this is a triggering event. If this doesn't go well here, it's going to impact that over there. And that helped people in their minds connect their dots. I'm really worried about that issue. Therefore, this trigger is just as important. And so I had a lot more attention and commitment and responsibility around those triggers.
So that's interesting. You just mentioned impact to project, using the triggers, looking at the impact and that sort of thing. So should a risk become realized, should it perhaps become a true issue? How do you measure your impact to, say, your overall project success when that occurs?
So when I'm just looking at a risk, it's a future event, right?
Yeah.
And I'm saying, okay, if that risk occurs, we're going to have to respond. Number one, that risk itself is going to push around my schedule and budget. And number two, my response to that risk is going to push around that budget and that schedule. So what I have to do is estimation. I treat my, response time, and I treat the risk occurring as actual activities on my schedule. I don't put them as activities on the schedule. I add them as reserve onto the activities within which those risks might occur. So basically, it's just taking those individual activity estimations, saying, okay, I'm going to account for that in that activity. If that doesn't happen, we'll just finish that activity early.
So that way that you keep them top of mind all the time.
Yeah. And again, it's really nice because you have your Gantt chart and you have your burn down chart and you have your risks, and all of a sudden your risks are pointing to your schedule. Your Gantt chart is demonstrating the schedule. Your burn down chart is completing the schedule, and you sort of have a big picture that ties everything together.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know that we've ever, on the project teams that I've been, I'm not sure I've ever looked at it from that perspective, but you've just given me an idea. I will replay your answer after this meeting and see if I can apply it. But here's the other thing is that I found I have worked with some client executives who were very risk tolerant. And so I paid less attention. It's not that I didn't pay any attention, but I wasn't as, on top of needing to respond all the time. I've also worked with client executives who were extremely not risk tolerant. And if they ever got wind of a risk, which typically we would put into our risk register, they wanted to mitigate it immediately. And in those situations, we ended up expending extra resources to satisfy that client executive. So I think there's also kind of a understanding of risk tolerance and building that into your ability to respond to those risks.
It's sort of like having a microphone. And you know how you can set the sensitivity of your microphone to either pick things up or not pick things up, right? You can set the volume lower on the microphone so it just picks up your voice, doesn't pick up anything in the background. But if the tolerance to risk that they have, the tolerance to the sound, that's not just the voice sound, but the ambient sound, and the microphone has to be more sensitive to pick that up. And so you have to do it. And if we actually go and talk about this, we can talk about a threshold too.
Yeah.
Because the tolerance is that response and the ability to be sensitive enough to respond, in an effective manner based on the environment. But you have a threshold, which is a line that you're not going to cross, right? Because on the microphone, that threshold is where I hit that horrible distortion and things sound really bad, and I have to take action against that. But below that threshold, it's normal, and I don't have to worry about it so much. And so I like to think about using a microphone in recording actually to talk about these things like threshold and tolerance, and it actually communicates it really well to my stakeholders.
It does, and I think the example that I just used also makes sure that we as project managers who are naturally born miracle workers, we also need to understand that risk tolerance of our client and how much time do we spend educating and how much time do we spend responding and mitigating. So there's always that what would I say, optimal effort in terms of how it is that we deal with the risks and issues.
Let me give you an example that's so important about this. Okay. Governance, getting a signature. Like you may have to have a signature from a senior executive in the state, and everybody says, oh, that's a milestone, we'll just put it here. The problem is, if you have a milestone and you don't identify the risk, there's something in humans' brains that say, oh, we'll just have that happen. But if you put a risk, you're going to say, okay, there's a chance, if it's only a 5% chance, there's a chance that they might not get that signature. They're out sick, or they're on vacation, or their backup isn't available for that signature, right? What's the impact? Just having that conversation with your stakeholder and your team, saying, we're identifying a risk around that governance. And if that doesn't happen, what happens?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is such an important conversation to have.
Well, and what it's forcing the client to work with you on is that you're not just going to accept the risk. You're going to mitigate it as soon as possible with that upfront conversation.
Right. And all of a sudden it opens up the discussion of saying, okay, we can't do anything until the day that we find out this person is sick, right? So we're going to have to start talking about triggers and educating our stakeholders on triggers and how we can build these early warning systems in so that we can actually, bypass that risk and get, and avoid that risk.
So once a risk is realized into a true issue, have you ever had a situation where you over responded to that issue?
Oh, all the time. Yeah. And that's all right. It's like packing, you're on a day trip and you pack for 3 days of food, oops. And that's in my home life, that's all right. But I have to be very careful on my projects. Sometimes it's okay to pack 3 or 4 extra sandwiches on your project. But if you're budget constrained or time constrained, you have to be incredibly precise. So you're going to be opening up that risk register in the issue log on a regular basis.
Yeah. So if over response requires an over allocation of resources that come away from what it is that you're trying to do in the project and delays the project, then that issue, which was over here, has now created another issue called project delay. So yeah, you have to be very careful.
I understood early this whole concept about optimal planning, and I saw that when I was studying and I was starting to teach quality and quality management, because you have optimal quality. And they did such a good job with ISO 9000 and TQM. And they said, okay, let's call optimal quality where the costs of doing that quality equal the benefits. It's that break even. And you don't want to go over that break even because you're spending cost on that without getting any benefit from it. And we can use that optimal mindset when we're looking at managing issues and also planning that reserve for our risk. What's enough to cover the cost of that occurring? Basically, what's the benefit of that risk planning, without having it cost and not getting anything in return?
Well, I think that's the call we'd make as we become more familiar with these processes. That what you're saying is, if you're looking at a scale, you're trying to optimally weigh the benefits of your response with the cost of actually managing that particular issue. So if you can come to an equilibrium, then you have dealt with it correctly.
Yeah, appropriately. It's like riding a bike. It's just like riding a bike. You're able to be, moving forward instead of constantly going back and forth and back and forth.
And the nice thing about this, and this is where I really like to encourage those of who are listening to us who are a little younger in their careers, a little less established as project managers. Judgment calls come with making calls. And eventually you develop that sixth sense, that extra sense of judgment, whereby you can make the kinds of decisions that we're talking about so that the benefit of your response does equal the cost of managing that particular issue. So if you feel as a listener that you're not there and that this is way too hard, it's not. You develop that judgment, that sixth sense, and eventually experience outweighs any kind of mistakes you can make.
You know what really helped me early on in this? Asking questions before giving answers.
Yeah.
Experts. There's always somebody who's 5 to 10 years more experienced than me in the project. If it's not on the project, they're a person who's been working 3 decades in the industry, or they're that shop manager who's been working up the ranks, and they're just relaxed in the back and smiling at everybody else running around with their hair on fire.
Yeah.
And it really does, number one, it makes me feel confident when I just have the ability to reach out and, say, is this common sense? And second of all, have me, maybe ask them for any advice they have on that. And they're more than willing to give the advice. These type of experts are always there, but nobody asks them any questions.
Well, as many years as I've had, and I've been hands-on IT over 40 years, not all of that's management, but a lot of it, a substantial amount. As many years as I've had, this week alone, yesterday, I was putting a risk and a response plan together for something that occurred on the project I'm working on. And when I finished, I'm looking at this delicacy, it's beautiful work of art. And I'm thinking, wow, I could submit this right now. And I thought, no, we have an IV&V specialist over here, independent validation and verification specialist. I'm going to bounce it off of him. And wouldn't you know, he and his team took it and came back with some ideas that I never thought of, and that actually bolstered what it was that I was presenting in the risk. So yeah, whether you're 10 years or 40 years, absolutely what you just said is correct. Get other people to look at what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, and honestly, always go in with questions.
Yes.
Once you start making statements, everybody thinks that's the way things are going to be. And number one, that's the way they're going to be. It's not going to be better. And number two, you've just turned off people from offering advice in the future.
But Tim, you and I, with all of our years and years of experience, the fact that we are on a project and we never write up an issue, doesn't that just show what good project management processes we have?
It's not life, though. It's, you can do that in a Petri dish, but you can't do that with a real world experience. Are
you saying that a lack of issues does not mean I'm a good project manager?
That's correct. It means that you're not doing your homework. You're not researching. You're not exposing the issues that you don't see.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Of course, you picked up on my sarcasm, right? So.
Oh yeah. And again, it's the same thing with risks. Both risks an issue. There is no experience in our lives or in the world that don't have some component of both issues and risks. And there's always something we can do about it, because risks are not just threats. Risks are also opportunities.
That's true. But in the situation where they might expose something that is a threat, it's not wrong to be completely transparent and keep people in the know. It's, to hide a risk, to put it under the covers, to hide issues, that is not a healthy project.
Well, and not only that, but as I've learned over my career, it exposes you as, number one, an expert. Number two, is somebody confident that you're able to handle that. I'm not talking about bravado. Bravado is confidence without experience, right? Yeah. I'm talking about being able to say, I did this, I was able to do this, therefore I can do this future thing. And people recognize that. We have this unidentified sense of when people are actually talking from real experience.
Right. Versus those people who think. And, just turn on your 6 o'clock news and watch some of our public legislators hide issues. And then what happens when they think that by hiding issues, it makes them look better. It doesn't. It never does. So I think the idea is that we embrace, not just understand, but embrace the truth of the situation, be completely transparent so that we can collectively handle the crisis, or well, I shouldn't say crisis, but the issue that's come upon us. We need to collaboratively make it go away.
You know, this is so entertaining to me. It shouldn't be, but it really is entertaining. It plays back on what I was talking in my class today about. We were talking about ethics, and we were talking about transparency of sharing information and why it's important. And you just nailed that, you know, right in the center of the target.
Well, and a lot of it is I'm coming off of something that you're fond of saying, and maybe you can elaborate. When we debate an issue or work with an issue collaboratively to mitigate it, to get rid of it, to put it away, we attack the issue, not the person. I know you're fond of using those kinds of accolades for our team members.
Oh yeah. And let's actually dive into that. I have a wonderful script I go through when we go through ethics and ethical decisions. You know, we expose problems and issues, but the issues are never people. Even if we think they're people issues, it's not. See, number one, it's the behaviors and actions. People are not bad. It's what they provide. I'm a project manager. I don't have to, you know, eat breakfast with these people. I don't have to eat dinner with these people. They make their own decisions and they're carved their way through life, and that's as it should be. And when they get on the project, it's not the people that's the problem. It's the actions and behaviors. So number one, I want to treat actions and behaviors and let people be who they want to be. And that's fine. That's fine because it gives them a sense of autonomy, right? Exactly. Second of all, it focuses where they can actually make changes. Because when I say you have to change, I'm attacking the individual, and they have a lot of emotional attachment to me. But when I say this behavior has to change, we're looking at the action, which is somewhat isolated from the individual. And I'm not talking, you know, I'm not talking directly at them as the problem. And therefore, they don't have to protect themselves as much. They don't have to, you know, they don't have to put up their guard as much. They can actually help me in solving the issue. And if I attack them, they're the experts because they're closest to the issue. And I've just defeated myself if I'm saying you're the problem.
Well, and the other way I look at that, and I've learned this over the years, the other way I look at that is if I put a person in a position on a project whereby that person cannot succeed to the, you know, to my expectation, then it's my problem because I did not understand that person's abilities for that position. So a lot of it is, why would I blame the person? I still have an issue to deal with, but in the meantime, perhaps that issue was caused by my bad judgment in putting the person in that place. So yeah, everything we're talking about as project managers, we deal with the actions, not the person.
Yes, yes. And it's so much easier to change actions than to change people.
Oh, so much.
Even when you have to replace people, it's so much easier to focus on the actions and the behavior and not the people. You can actually take care of people even as you're transitioning them out. Now, but we're getting far afield from issues and risks. However, this human component really is important because managing and resolving issues and planning for and preparing for risks is a collaborative event. It's not an individual event.
That's true. And in doing that, you just mentioned collaborative. I've mentioned collaborative. I am a very collaborative person on projects. When we do understand an issue or even a risk that may be realized, how do you particularly know, how do you understand when it's time to engage the stakeholders, your client management, whoever? How do you know when it's time to get them engaged in helping solve or mitigate the issue?
When it impacts them. So here's what I do. Okay, both my issue log and my risk register are prioritized. And I'm always talking about my top three and top 3 and 5, right? And we say these are the ones that are highest priority, because if I try to focus on all of them, I'm going to give each one of my risks and issues maybe 2-3 minutes, and that's not enough. And then it doesn't confuse the stakeholders either. And now to switch gears a little bit, all of my top risks and issues are impacting project success in some way or another. And
Yep.
if it impacts project success, they need to know about it.
Exactly.
Number one, they need to know about it in case they know they can help me take action. Number two, they need to know about it so they can actually gain confidence that the project and I are doing what the project and I are supposed to do.
That's precisely the other thing I've learned, and you said it so well, that if it affects them, which it does, it's their project, then we need to be transparent and involve them in understanding the problem and also perhaps mitigating it or resolving it. But here's the other thing is I've also learned, remember the story I gave you before in terms of having some more or some less risk tolerant client executive sponsors. Mm-hmm. So in those situations, knowing that, I'm very careful as to how I present the issue or risk, because I want to do it without alarm. I want to do it in a calming way so that they understand that there's something here, but we collaboratively can get it in hand. So again, there's some, we're talking about the technicalities of managing a project, but there's so much more in terms of some of the surrounding elements that we also have to deal with, like managing our clients.
Yeah, this is the nuance of working with stakeholders and risk and issues. Now, just like the microphone, it's understanding that some people's ears hear things that we don't. And we have to be understanding enough to set the volume of the microphone and the speakers so that, it doesn't go outside of what the stakeholders need to do. And I remember back in 2003 through 2005, I had a director and he was wonderful. But when I brought him a risk or issue, he always thought the sky was falling. Mm-hmm. And so I had to be ready for the sky is falling conversations and prepare them for a more reasonable interpretation of these issues or risks.
Well, the other thing we have to be mindful of, even as a young project manager, has been involved in projects prior to them becoming a project manager. So they've been exposed to the whole idea of risk tolerance, risks, issues, mitigation, acceptance, all of those sorts of things that we throw around. We have to remember that our clients have probably not been exposed to the whole idea of risks and issues. And so again, we need to treat that relationship in a way that they help us rather than, as you were saying, sky is falling, panic.
Exactly. One of the greatest tools I had was prioritization, and the current teaching in issues is actually classification of issues by priority. Like we have blockers now. This is just the terminology that started showing up in training maybe 3 years ago. A blocker is just like a high impact risk. It means work stoppage. An impediment, it slows work. And then we have obstacles. And an obstacle is an issue that we can go around or over or under or through with some extra effort. So using this terminology and setting it up in the kickoff and setting it up in the in the regular communication, here's our red, there are blockers and so forth and so forth. It allows them to have a realistic understanding of this is work stoppage and this is work slowage. And we can actually have, have the meaningful conversations about what does this mean for what you're curious about.
And that just makes a lot of sense. And I've actually been in situations where, a risk or an issue is perhaps causing me to panic on the inside a little bit, becoming transparent with my stakeholder, and they go, "Oh, that's easy. Let me make a phone call."
Exactly.
And it's gone. And it's gone.
Exactly. And it's not being, totally callous, and it's not being totally cavalier. It's being realistic and saying, here are the issues and here's what I'm concerned about. And do you have any knowledge? Do you have any knowledge? Right? Asking the questions. And again, it's approaching things in a reasonable way, consistently enough so that they see you sitting back and not panicking, using, thoughtful analysis and understanding that we'll get through this. We don't know how right this second, but together we'll figure it out.
Yeah. And I like your idea of prioritization. I guess in IT, probably throughout most of my career, prioritization has become kind of a second nature to us, whether we're whether we're coding, whether we're doing analysis, doesn't matter, sort of that whole prioritization. And I know with risks, and I think you've probably been there as well, we've developed over time, and it's in the literature, where you can kind of look at the probability of something happening and the severity of what would happen, what would result if it did happen, and somehow you combine those two and you come up with a risk score of some sort. So that also, that scoring helps to prioritize the risks that you need to pay more attention to versus the ones you can kind of hold at arm's length.
But getting back to what you just said, what does that mean for the stakeholder? Yeah. Not just what does this mean for the schedule or the budget or the quality or my project team, but what does it mean to this stakeholder? And we need to be the ones to help them understand that, whether it's a huge impact and we really need to sit down over, a cup of coffee and think about this, or whether it's, this is what it means to project success. Let's talk about this. And what are your thoughts? The whole conversation is the risk and issue management is not just a project manager's job. It's something that we work together on, and we don't know how, but we'll figure it out. And from the time that the project starts, that should be, first in mind of a project manager's. And you're right, I'm the same way. If something happens, I panic. I have to. Because I'm the one who is supposed to panic first before anybody else, because then I'm going to get those emotions out of the way, and then I can have a reasonable approach. If I process through all that before anybody else, then I'm ready to help them process those emotions and get to the solution.
Well, and that's exactly right. And I've also put on these particular podcasts the name of my company, People First Project Management. And I think it was several years ago when I was observing how we as IT people behaved on projects. And I realized that when we brought our clients or stakeholders along with us, how much more successful we can be, which is why I named my company that. But as you were saying, a lot of times I will actually, even as I'm panicking on the inside, involve my stakeholder as quickly as I can, because more often than not, they have the solution that I'm trying to get to, and it affects them, it affects their end result of the project that we're working on collaboratively. And as a result of that, it's a wonderful thing to keep them involved and informed.
Exactly. So as we're getting close to the end of the show today, do you have any final words for people that could possibly be my students or possibly just starting to understand the benefit and the value and how critical it is to manage issues and risks?
I do, and I do it from my own experience. One was I had to, at some point early in my career, humble myself from not knowing everything and asking for help and asking for guidance. And once I understood more of that, and then also involving my client, getting them to this, getting all of us to the same situation where we're working on it together, it didn't matter how green I was or how experienced it was, I couldn't do it on my own. And I think that's probably the best advice I can give anybody. You can't do this on your own.
Oh yeah, it's a group effort. That I would echo that as well. And again, you know, from when we start as project managers to midway through our careers, we think that we work in isolation. and you know, having your council of elders that you can go through and you know, bounce ideas off, not just your stakeholders, but you know, experts and peers outside of your project environment, where you can do a lot of sanity checking. There's incredible value in that as well.
Well, and if I can be a little bit of a naysayer for our particular career choice, a lot of times, and don't get me wrong, I value PMI and the advice and guidance we get. I value what the PMBOK says, but it's a guidance. It's not a set of rules. And I've been in situations where the PMBOK guidance wasn't as good as the guidance I got from you, like you said, the Council of Elders. And so we have to be open to all of that. That yes, the textbook learning and the guidance we receive from the experts is good, but they're not in every situation and they're not there. So you asked what I would tell a young person: rely on the PMBOK, but also rely on those around you who are willing to help.
You know, the project management body of knowledge is catching up with you. It really is. The 7th edition is masterful for that very reason. If you go into the 6th edition, it has like 2 or 3 paragraphs on something called tailoring. It's the conscious adjustment based on the business environment, based on OPAs, based on experts, and a few other things, right? Well, in the 7th edition, they have an entire section on this, section 3. And it's like, you know, here's what we mean by tailoring. Here are the processes you go through tailoring. Here's the area of the project that can easily benefit from tailoring, and onward and onward. And they've actually embraced this concept that we're not talking about rules, laws, and policies. We're talking about, you know, good practice. We're talking about things that we figured out make projects better. But if you need to tailor, the PMBOK says, hey, you know, tailoring has incredible benefit.
Yeah, no, I've always believed that. So I think we have had a great, grand discussion of the whole topic of issues and risks. What do you think?
Yes, we have, and we've actually gone full circle. I've touched on things that I'm curious about, and you've actually answered some of my questions I had on issues and risks too, and I appreciate that.
Well, and like I said, I'm going to go play this back and pick up on some of what you also talked about. So that's great.
Yeah, this is exciting. I'm glad we have this conversation, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to have in the future. That's for certain. And in fact, in that mode, Merv, where can we find you if we have questions?
Best place is LinkedIn. Best place. I troll LinkedIn every single morning when I get up. So
I wish I did.
Very good. So until next week,
we'll have some fun. And thanks again, Merv.
You bet. Thanks.